Hey guys, for those of you who are new to my channel, my name is Dr. Mickey Pardo. I'm a biologist and I study animal behavior and ecology. Recently, I published a study showing for the first time that elephants address one another with name-like calls. I've honestly been blown away by how much media attention this study has gotten. It's been featured by major media outlets all over the world, including the New York Times, National Geographic, and the BBC, just to name a few. This study took more than 4 years of blood, sweat, tears, and nasty tropical diseases to complete. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about the backstory behind the study and how my colleagues and I figured out that elephants have these name-like calls. I did most of the work for this study in Samburu and Buffalo Springs National Reserves in northern Kenya, where the elephant population has been studied for decades by my former supervisor George Whittemire and by the conservation organization Save the Elephants. Because this population has been so thoroughly studied, we can identify all of the elephants in this population by the unique pattern of nicks and tears in their ears, and we've come up with names for all of them to help us remember who's who. So for example, this is Donatella. She's about 40 years old, and she's the matriarch of an elephant family called the Artist Two, where every elephant is named after a famous artist. You can tell it's Donatella because she has this sort of unique C-shaped cut on both of her ears, and she has sort of medium-length, mildly curved tusks. And this is Rothko, an elephant from the same family. You can see in this photo that she has a distinctive floppy right ear, and her right tusk is shorter than the left one. And in this photo, you can see that she has a little piece missing from her left ear. So anyway, we call these elephants Donatella and Rothko, but obviously that's not what other elephants call them. Toward the end of this video, I'll let you hear what we think their real names sound like and tell you the story of their family. But first, I want to tell you how we discovered that elephants have names, or something like a name, in the first place. I first came up with the idea for this project more than 11 years ago, when I was in my first semester of grad school. I was inspired by an ingenious study I read showing that bottlenose dolphins could effectively call one another by name by imitating the unique signature whistle of the individual they were trying to address. Bottlenose dolphins each have their own unique whistle, called a signature whistle, and most of the time they use it to announce their identity to other dolphins, kind of like if I went around saying Mickey, Mickey, Mickey all the time to introduce myself. But occasionally, a dolphin will imitate someone else's signature whistle to get their attention, effectively calling them by name. And I wondered if elephants could do something similar, since like dolphins, elephants have a rare ability to imitate sounds. But I wasn't able to pursue the idea at the time, so I held on to it, and then as soon as I finished my PhD, I wrote a grant proposal to do this study as a postdoctoral researcher at Colorado State University under Professor George Whittemire, and it got funded. So the first stage of this project was to record as many elephant calls as possible, and note not just who made each call, but also who they were addressing. And I spent about 14 months at the Save the Elephants research camp in northern Kenya recording elephants. My co-author David Loturagi and I would spend about 7 hours a day, 6 days a week, following elephants around in a pickup truck, recording almost continuously. I could never have done this work without David, who goes by the nickname Leaderboard. He has an incredible memory for elephants, and he's actually the one who taught me to identify them in the first place. Whenever we heard a call, we tried to figure out who the call was addressed to based on the context. So for example, if two elephants approached one another and one of them made a greeting call, we could reasonably assume that she was calling to the individual that she had just approached. But when elephants made long-distance contact calls, which they used to communicate with family members who are out of sight, it was often a lot harder to figure out who they were addressing because we couldn't see both the caller and the recipient at the same time. So in this situation, sometimes we were able to figure out who the call was addressed to because there was one individual lagging behind the rest of the group, and we had been following the group all day, so we knew who was with the main body of the group and who was lagging behind. And if one elephant in the main body of the group made a call while facing in the direction of the one individual who was lagging behind, then in that situation, we could infer that she was calling to the individual who was lagging. But obviously, sometimes we weren't able to figure this out, so we weren't able to identify the recipient for all of these long-distance contact calls. In the end, I managed to record several hundred calls where we knew who made the call and who the call was addressed to. And another one of my co-authors, Joyce Poole, provided some additional recordings that she had recorded years earlier in Amboseli National Park in southern Kenya. So once I had all these recordings, I brought them back home to Colorado and started working on analyzing them. The calls that most people think of when they think of elephants are trumpets. But actually, trumpets are basically just emotional outbursts that elephants make when they're excited or alarmed, and they're not even the most common calls that elephants make. The vast majority of calls that elephants make are low-pitched vocalizations called rumbles, which are actually so low in pitch that they're partially below the range of human hearing. And this is what the part of the rumble that you can hear sounds like. Rumbles are very complex vocalizations, and they convey a lot of different pieces of information at once. So we thought that if elephants have names, they would likely be embedded as just one piece of information within these rumbles. Because rumbles are so complex, it's really hard to identify patterns in the calls just by listening to them or even by looking at a sonogram, so we decided to use machine learning for this analysis. Together with another one of my co-authors, Kurt Fristrup, I converted all of the calls into a string of numbers that represented the sound patterns of the call. Then we used these numbers to train a type of machine learning model called a random forest to identify who a call was addressed to just from the sound patterns of the call. The idea was that if elephant calls contain something like a name, then the random forest should be able to pick up on patterns in the call identifying the intended recipient. But if elephants don't have names, then there should be nothing for the model to pick up on. The random forest successfully identified the recipient for 27.5% of the calls. Now this may not seem like a lot, but just like humans don't use names in every sentence, we wouldn't expect every single elephant call to contain a name either. Since we had no way of knowing ahead of time which calls might contain a name and which didn't, we had to just throw all the calls at the random forest, so it's not surprising that it wasn't able to identify the recipient for all the calls. To see if this figure of 27.5% correct was actually meaningful, or whether the model could have gotten that many correct just by dumb luck, we compared this result to how well the model would have been able to perform if we fed it meaningless data that were randomly scrambled. It turns out that when fed randomly scrambled, totally uninformative data, the model was extremely unlikely to get 27.5% of the calls correct. In fact, the chance of it correctly identifying the receiver for 27.5% of the calls with uninformative data was less than 1 in 10,000. So that means that at least some of the calls must have contained some information about the intended recipient in order for the model to correctly predict the receiver for 27.5% of the calls. But this alone didn't necessarily mean that elephants have names. We first had to rule out some simpler explanations. So for example, we know that just like humans, elephants have unique voices. So what if the model was just picking up on the unique voice patterns of the caller and then using that to guess who the recipient of the call was most likely to be based on who that caller tended to call to most often? To rule this possibility out, we used the random forest to generate something called proximity scores, which are basically a measure of how similar any two calls in the dataset are to one another. If elephants use the same call to address everyone, then two calls from the same caller to two different recipients should be just as similar on average as two calls from the same caller to the same recipient. But we found that on average, two calls from the same caller to the same recipient were significantly more similar than two calls from the same caller to two different recipients. So that means that elephants are using different calls to address different members of their family. In other words, they're using something like a name. The next piece of this study was to determine if elephants could actually perceive and respond to these names. To do that, we played back recorded calls to 17 different elephants. Each elephant was played two different calls, a recording of a call that was originally addressed to them, and a recording of a call from the same caller that was originally addressed to someone else. The idea was that if these calls contain the name of the intended recipient, then elephants should respond more strongly to the call that was originally addressed to them. I'm going to show you two clips of playback trials that we did. Both of these playbacks were done with the same individual, a female that we call Margaret. The recording that we played back in one of the clips was a call that was originally addressed to Margaret, in other words, a call that we think might be Margaret's name. And the recording that we played back in the other clip was a call from the same caller that was originally addressed to someone else, in other words, a call that we think might be someone else's name. And I want you to see if you can guess which call was which, just by looking at Margaret's reaction to the two playbacks. So here's the first clip. And here's the second clip. Before I tell you which call was which, pause the video and let me know in the comments what you think. Which clip do you think showed Margaret reacting to a call that was originally addressed to her? If you guessed the first clip, you're right. Margaret called back immediately in response to this playback, whereas in response to the other playback, she lifted her head but never called back. Now, the difference in response to the two playbacks wasn't always this clear-cut. Sometimes the elephants ignored both playbacks altogether. But on average, elephants responded significantly more strongly to calls that were originally addressed to them compared to calls from the same caller that were originally addressed to someone else. Specifically, when elephants heard a call that was originally addressed to them, they tended to approach the speaker sooner, they tended to vocalize sooner, and they also tended to produce more calls in response. This showed that elephants could tell just by hearing a call whether it was intended for them or for someone else. So taken together, I think these results provide pretty convincing evidence that elephants address one another with something like a name. But I wasn't satisfied with just that. I also wanted to understand more about how exactly elephant names work and how similar they are to the types of names used by other animals like humans or bottlenose dolphins. Remember I said at the beginning of this video that dolphins address one another by imitating the signature whistle of the individual they're trying to address? Elephants don't have specific signature calls as far as we know, but it's still possible that they address one another by imitating the overall voice patterns of the individual that they're trying to address. If this is the case, then calls addressed to a given elephant should sound more similar to her calls than to the calls of other individuals. But we found no evidence that this was the case. On average, calls addressed to a given elephant were no more similar to the recipient's own calls than they were to the calls of other elephants. And the random forest was able to identify who a call was addressed to, regardless of whether that call was similar to the recipient's calls or not. We didn't have enough recordings from each elephant to be absolutely confident in these results, but so far at least, it seems that unlike dolphins, elephants are not addressing each other by imitating the recipient's calls. This is really interesting because one of the key features of human language is that most of our words are arbitrary in structure. In other words, most of our words have no inherent connection to the sounds made by whatever they refer to. We do have some words that are imitations of the thing they refer to. For example, words like buzz and swish. But if we could only talk about things that made a sound that we could imitate, that would really limit the number of things we could talk about. So finding that elephants also potentially name things, in this case each other, without relying on imitation is pretty intriguing. Another thing we wanted to know is whether different elephants use the same name to address the same individual. And unfortunately, we weren't able to get a definitive answer to this question because we got conflicting results from two different analyses. So on the one hand, calls from different callers addressed to the same recipient were significantly more similar on average than calls from different callers addressed to different recipients. So that suggests that different callers are at least using somewhat similar names to address the same individual. But on the other hand, when we tried to train a new random forest model to identify the recipient of a call using cues that generalized across different callers, it wasn't able to do it. So that suggests that the names used by different callers for the same individual sound different enough that the random forest wasn't able to recognize them as a single category. Now, this might simply be a limitation of our data. It could be that different callers really do use the same name to address the same individual, but because every caller has a unique voice, the same name sounds different when pronounced by different callers. And it could be that the random forest simply didn't have enough data to be able to learn that the same name as pronounced by different callers was actually the same name. Alternatively, it might be that different callers use distinct nicknames that nonetheless share some features in common to address the same individual. A loose analogy in human terms might be a woman who is called Elizabeth by her mother, Ellie by her sister, and Liz by her friends. At this point, we just don't know to what extent different elephants use the same name to address the same individual, but it's definitely a question that I hope to answer in the future. Now, there's one last analysis that I wanted to talk about. As I mentioned earlier, we didn't expect elephants to use names in every call, but we had no way of knowing ahead of time which calls contained a name and which didn't. So to figure out which types of rumbles are most likely to contain names, I looked at how often the random forest correctly predicted the recipient for different types of rumbles. Specifically, I looked at 3 different types of rumbles. Contact rumbles, which are long-distance calls used for communication with family members who are out of sight. Greeting rumbles, which are close-distance rumbles made when 2 elephants, usually 2 adults, approach one another to within touching distance. And coo rumbles, which are rumbles that adult and adolescent females make at close distance to calves in a caregiving context. It turned out that the model correctly predicted the recipient for 42% of contact rumbles, but only 4% of greeting rumbles. And if you think about it, it totally makes sense that elephants would be more likely to use names in a contact calling context when the elephant that they're trying to address can't see them. But here's where it gets interesting. The model correctly predicted the recipient for 47% of coo rumbles, even though these calls are also made at close distance. So that suggests that close-distance coo rumbles are just as likely to contain names as long-distance contact rumbles, even though close-distance greeting rumbles rarely seem to include names. The difference between coo rumbles and greeting rumbles is that greeting rumbles are mostly made between adults, whereas coo rumbles are made by adults or adolescents to young calves. So at this point, this is just a hypothesis, but I think it's possible that the reason why elephants are more likely to use the recipient's name when calling to a calf at close distance is because this is how the calves learn their names. When I saw this result, it reminded me of the time that Leaderboard and I found an elephant called Matisse a few hours after she had given birth, and she was making coo rumbles to the baby over and over and over again. I saw this a few other times too, where a female who had just given birth kept making these coo rumbles to her newborn calf, and I can't help but wonder, did I literally witness the moment where a baby elephant got her name? Speaking of the names for specific individuals, at the beginning of this video, I promised that I would let you hear the real names of Donatella and Rothko and tell you the story of their family, the artists too. Unfortunately, the story is pretty tragic. When the Samburu Elephant Research Project first began in the 1990s, the matriarch of the Artist 2 family was a female named Titian, who was Rothko's grandmother. Donatella was closely related to Titian too, maybe her younger sister or her daughter. In 2009, there was a terrible wave of ivory poaching in Samburu, and Titian was shot and killed. As the next oldest female, Donatella stepped up and took over as matriarch. Then the very next year, Titian's daughter Renoir, who was Rothko's mother, was shot in the neck, and even though a veterinarian managed to treat Renoir and tried to save her life, unfortunately she didn't make it. Rothko was just shy of her 8th birthday when her mother was killed, which is still just a juvenile for an elephant. So she became an orphan, and that made things a little difficult for her socially, because female elephants rely on their mother's connections to build their own social network. Rothko ended up becoming very close with Titian's orphan daughter Frida. Even though Frida was technically Rothko's aunt, she was actually about 7 months younger than Rothko, so they were very close in age, and they both lost their mothers around the same time. Rothko and Frida became super bonded, and when I was in Kenya, if I saw one of them, I usually saw them both. They even had calves of their own around the same time, so their kids grew up playing together too. So it's not too surprising that when I recorded someone calling to Rothko by name, it was usually Frida. So here's a recording of Frida calling to Rothko with what we believe to be Rothko's real name. For comparison, here's a recording of Frida calling to Donatella with what we believe to be Donatella's real name. Now you probably can't hear much difference between these two calls. And that's because most of the frequencies in elephant rumbles are so low in pitch that most commercially available speakers can't reproduce them. So you're actually only hearing a tiny fraction of the call. And even if your speakers or headphones weren't the issue, you still wouldn't be able to hear the full call because part of it is so low pitched that it's below the limit of human hearing. So I'm going to play the same calls again, but this time sped up to 5 times the original speed so you can hear the full frequency spectrum of the call. This is Frida calling to Rothko, and this is Frida calling to Donatella. Did you hear the difference this time? Let me know in the comments. Now, I wish I could give you a happy ending to this story, but unfortunately, the Artist 2 family suffered even more tragedy. In 2001, one of the other researchers in camp told me that Rothko had been shot and injured. Leaderboard and I drove to her location immediately, and we called the wildlife vet to come help. At first, we were hopeful that she might survive because the bullet hole was pretty small and was in her hindquarters. But after about a week, she collapsed and died, and when the veterinary team did a post-mortem examination, they found that the bullet had perforated her intestines, so she died slowly of internal bleeding and sepsis. Rothko had 2 calves, a 6-year-old daughter and a son who was less than 2 years old. Remarkably, they managed to survive on their own for a while, mostly by hanging out with Frida. But eventually, the baby had to be captured and taken to an elephant orphanage because it became clear that he wasn't going to survive on his own. Elephants only produce enough milk for 1 calf at a time, so it wasn't possible for any of the other females in the family to nurse him. So human violence has now impacted 4 generations of this family, which is as long as scientists have been studying this population of elephants. But unlike her mother and grandmother, Rothko probably wasn't shot by people interested in her tusks. Ivory poaching in Kenya has fortunately dropped off considerably in recent years, although it's still a huge problem in other parts of Africa. Instead, Rothko's death was broadly ruled due to human-elephant conflict. Elephants in Samburu often run into conflict with people and their livestock over resources like water. But the thing is that Rothko was shot from behind inside a protected area, which makes it seem pretty unlikely that she was actually threatening anyone's life or property. And this type of killing is unfortunately something that's increasingly common in the Samburu and Buffalo Springs area, to the point where it's now one of the leading causes of death for elephants in this region. We don't know exactly why all of these elephants are getting shot, but the region unfortunately suffers from a lot of unrest, with heavily armed young men and teenagers shooting each other in tribal conflicts. It's possible that some of these armed men and boys are using elephants as target practice, or even shooting them as a form of protest against the local authorities. My hope is that the kind of behavioral research that I do might help change the way that people see elephants for the better. Obviously, if your survival is threatened by elephants eating your crops or breaking into your water tank, it doesn't much matter to you if those elephants have names. But I'm hopeful that letting people know how complex and fascinating elephants are could help in cases like Rothko's, where she was apparently shot for no reason by people who simply didn't think that her life had any value. I do think there's increasing awareness that the growing body of scientific knowledge about elephant cognition has profound implications for how we treat them. Last year, the city of Ojai, California passed an ordinance recognizing elephants as bearers of the legal right to bodily autonomy, the first law of any kind in the United States to grant legal rights to a non-human species. It's entirely symbolic, of course, because there are no elephants in Ojai, California, but I think it sets a really important precedent and is a very positive step in the right direction. But here's the thing, and this is where I want to pivot to a broader issue. While many people recognize the exceptional intelligence of a few select animals like elephants, dolphins, and chimpanzees, they often have no idea that many of the species regarded with indifference or even contempt are also far more cognitively complex than we've ever given them credit for. For example, most people don't realize that chickens can do arithmetic better than a 1-year-old human child and have a sophisticated vocal communication system of their own. Most people don't realize that rats are capable of empathy. They will go out of their way to rescue another rat in distress and will actually go hungry rather than press a lever to get food if they see that pressing that lever causes another rat to get an electric shock. And most people don't know that within the last few years, researchers have found that tiny fish called cleaner wrasse can recognize their reflection in a mirror, and after seeing their reflection, can even recognize their own face in a still photograph. This ability is thought to be an indication of self-awareness, something that human children take years to develop. And that's kind of the whole point of this channel. I want to teach people about the scientific evidence that these animals are cognitively and emotionally sophisticated individuals, and encourage people to think critically about whether it is really morally justifiable to continue denying them the most basic of rights, such as the right to not be killed, falsely imprisoned, or forcibly separated from their loved ones. The more I learn about the minds of other animals, the more I feel a sense of urgency to abolish the current system that slaughters them by the trillions and confines them in horrific conditions. And there is a growing movement to try to make this dream a reality. For example, this year, voters in Denver, Colorado will vote on a ballot measure to ban slaughterhouses in their city, and voters in Sonoma County, California will vote on a ballot measure to ban factory farms in their county. I hope that all of you who care about animals will be inspired to join this movement. We get so much joy from interacting with other animals and learning about their fascinating behavior. I think that the least we can do in return is to treat them like the complex individuals that we now know them to be, rather than commodities to be bought, sold, and killed. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.